wants to go first? We have
me, Kelly.
Okay, Kylie can go first. So go ahead and screen share.
Okay. Hi everyone, Kelly. Can you guys see the screen?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, so today I'm going to talk about the fact and biased news about climate change. What is climate change? Climate change describes a change in the average conditions, such as temperature and rainfall, in a region over a long period of time. NASA scientists have observed Earth's surface is warming, and many of the warmest years on record have happened in the past 20 years. Here is first fact-based news. The news article talks about the reason for climate change, and it proves that this phenomenon does exist. It has already brought some effects on our lives. For example, the news says the heat-trapping nature of carbon dioxide and other gases was demonstrated in the mid-19th century. Their ability to affect the transfer of infrared energy through the atmosphere is the scientific basis of many instruments flown by NASA. There is no question that the increased levels of greenhouse gases must cause Earth to warm in response. As we can see, these are all facts which are based on scientific research. And in this case, we can search on science websites for more reliable information. And here's the news from CNN. Scientists say climate change has caused a global increase in the frequency and severity of weather that raises the risk of wildfire. Climate change has brought higher temperatures and deeper droughts. This piece of information is from scientific reports, which are based on experiments. And as we know, the higher or lower temperature truly exist, so they're all facts. Here comes to the biased news. Fires have grown bigger, deadlier, and more destructive. In the coming decades, the nation will surely see even worse. Why? Climate change, fire suppression efforts, and the increasing number of Americans that have moved into fire-prone areas are to blame. This is also from CNN, and it is biased news. From the word will surely, we can see that the author has personal opinions and emotions in it. The American will surely become worse because of some inappropriate policies. And this report is more like a personal opinion or a blog. And this news comes from Times, which talk about the Donald Trump's reaction toward the climate change. President Donald Trump mocked climate change again on Sunday, just days after the Department of Defense released a report outlining the effects of climate change on its operations. And Time also posted a video. Let's see it. So in this video, this reporter only takes a part in their conversations, and it's easy to find out that the news reporter's opinion toward Donald Trump is very negative. And instead of talking about this thing, he always used some adjectives to describe Donald Trump, including the title, President Trump renews climate change denial days after Defense Department releases daunting report on its effect. These days, many media outlets criticize Donald Trump in various fields, and people always have personal opinions. And in this way, it's easier to arouse public opinion, especially for those people who work in some news agencies. So, as for what kind of sources can be fact-based, the news must be focus on truth. I think this is the primary point of fact-based news. And the second one is that journalists need to avoid being influenced by sources in any way, including financial and personal power, etc. As long as some journalists have been affected by outside opinions, it's very hard for them to write neutral reports. And the third factor is to be fair and impartial. Reporting should present both sides of any issue, and the context of the story should never be left out in order to manipulate the reader's understanding of the issue. And the last one is serve humanity. I think a commitment to use stories to impact the world in a positive way rather than causing harm. So in my mind, as for readers, they can have right to choose whether to trust the news or not, and they can have different opinions. But for the reporters, I think it's their duty to write and report reliable news and facts. And here are some different types of biased news. The first one is advertising bias. It consists of selecting media stories based on what will please the advertisers. And the second one is corporate bias. It means picking stories that are pleasing to the owners of the media, organization, or network. And the third one is concision bias. It is when a media outlet report wills that can be summed up in a few words rather than those which requires lengthier explanations. And the next one is called mainstream bias. It consists of reporting the same thing everyone else is reporting and avoiding offensive stories at the same time. So readers and viewers don't turn away. The last one is sensationalism. It is the form of bias wherein a media outlet chooses to report extraordinary events in favor of everyday events. So, in my opinion, I think there are some ways to identify biased news. The first one is coverage. Compared to what you found in other sources for the same topic, this content seems to omit a lot of information about the topic and emphasize vastly different aspects of it, and even some stereotypes or even overly simplify information. And the second one is evidence. So, compared to unbiased news, there seems to be a little evidence in documentation presented in biased news, just assertions that seem intent to pursue it by themselves. And the next one is vested interest. The author may have a vested interest in the topic, and I think this is very normal. For example, if the site asks for contributions, the author probably will benefit if his or her contributions are made. And the last one is imperative language. For example, there are many strongly worded assertions and may also have a lot of exclamation points. And these are the citations. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Before we get going, is Jacob here or what? Jacob? No? All right. Well, no Jacob. Okay. So, yeah, the climate change is a big issue. I mean, just like every other issue that's at the forefront of something that's discussed in the news, there's always at least two sides to every issue. Often hardly a third side, as the third side would by default put somebody in one of those two sides, right? And unfortunately, we've already talked. Oh, sorry, I'm here. Okay, I thought so. All right. Let me just put Jacob into the system. And it's been a very hotly contested issue in the United States, especially in the last, 4 years, because, one side, there's a lot of data, history, scientific research about the changing climate. But of course, on the other side, it's hard to, prove anything, especially since we talked about it, philosophy versus science. And science is always, everything in science is a theory, everything, thanks to philosophy and what we were taught about it. And, the news, that first article you posted with the CNN, talking about there always are fires and, people should stop living in fire-prone areas. Well, yes, in certain degree, places like California and Australia, I mean, a part of the biology of the ecosystem, we have fires by natural effect. But what we've seen in the last few years, the fires are getting much more common. They're becoming bigger fires, and it's hard to say that this is normal. I mean, it could be. We have seen ice ages happen. We have proof of ice ages, and that's climate change, and that's natural climate change. But I think the key idea here is what's man-made versus what is naturally happening. And that's the part that isn't often discussed as much as simply it's either climate change or it isn't, right? There's always more factors to everything. Yeah. Anyone else have something to say about that?
I think it's in Times Square. I thought it was really interesting to see they've set up a clock now.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah, 7 years of irreversible damage.
Mm-hmm. It was interesting to see, like, when that all started. It's just there. It's very intimidating.
Of course,
But
it's very intimidating.
reasons.
And Canada, just yesterday, it's a big thing all over the news about banning single-use plastics. Some countries have banned single-use plastics a long time ago. And one of the biggest factors and reasons why Canada took so long, and it's still a big contested issue, is the oil industry in Alberta. Remember what we talked about? On one hand, there's the environment, and the other hand, there's people's livelihoods. And there are a lot of products that are made out of petrochemicals. And one of the biggest things is, of course, plastic bags. But another one, which you don't even realize maybe, is the these reusable masks that we're being forced to wear. These are made out of gasoline, believe it or not.
How?
Well, it's they're made out of plastic, petroleum products, and yeah, I mean, polypropylene. Google it. Polypropylene is basically the material used in these masks. They're used once, they're thrown out. Unfortunately, I'm sure you guys have seen by now that they're often just thrown out on the road, or even if they're thrown in the garbage, often garbage makes it onto the roads and in the environment. And it's a weird dichotomy because we have to wear them, but they're killing the environment, right? And so at least Canada is banning single-use plastics. I'm not exactly sure if it's passed or not, but they've introduced the bill with huge backlash from the Alberta oil industry, right?
If they ban single-use plastics, will that ban like masks like that? Will everyone need to get reusable masks? No?
That's a good question, because the list of single-use plastics is a gray area, right? It's this is technically a single-use plastic, except because it's not seemingly plastic. I mean, I don't even know how many of you know that this is made out of polypropylene, which is a gasoline plastic product. Did any of you know this?
I thought it was made out of plastic, but just not that specific one.
Yeah, right. So, you guys as students are required to wear masks, but you can wear any mask you want. So, you have the choice of either wearing a reusable cotton mask or single-use disposable plastic polypropylene masks. It's your choice. Us as teachers and staff members, we're not given a choice. We have to wear the board mandated, polypropylene masks. And it's a big issue because, one thing, it's for the environment, but also there are countless, scientific studies talking about the dangers of plastic and polypropylene specifically on the human body, right? And now people are required by mandate to breathe it in. This is a political issue, right? I know there are teachers who are fighting for us to be able to wear our own provided masks, right? Like cotton, organic, whatever you want, for a number of issues, right? Because these propylene ones are horrible for your health, ironically, because you're using it to save help out with the cause against COVID by inhaling petrochemical products all day, right? So long-term effects, short-term effects, this is also new, right? And if this is going to be the world for 10 years or more, which, I highly believe that it will be, this is one of those political fights that needs to be fought.
It was really, it was interesting because I was watching something about the Spanish flu, and it was showing pictures and posters, and it was all about like them wearing masks, and it was really interesting to see everything kind of come full circle, because it was like you saw the old time masks, all these people wore masks, and
Sure.
just the same way we are, these face coverings to protect themselves from this. So eventually it's gonna go back to normal, hopefully.
Well, it resurfaces because that wasn't the first time in history where people wore masks. Plague doctors, Google plague doctor, right?
Yeah.
If you see that picture, you think, oh yeah, it's like a Halloween costume, but that was a mask worn during, the couple plague times in our history. And I think this time around it's a little different because of technology.
Almost definitely.
And I think there's, many people argue that there's forces behind, how can I put this? Opportunists, right? Using the COVID pandemic to further their agenda, right? I mean, Google, all these companies, Amazon, have made billions of dollars off the pandemic, right?
Isn't one of them gonna on set to be a trillionaire?
Well, just the other day, it was announced that for the first time in history, the rich have become past the $10 trillion mark or whatever.
That's insane.
Right? And when we talked, was it 2 days ago? Someone had their presentation on the, rich keep getting richer, and that graph that we were shown, but then the average everyday person's graph stayed the same or lowered or who knows what, right?
Mm-hmm.
These are political issues. But the official ministry response to teachers asking if they can wear their own masks is, well, by us providing everybody the same mask, they can ensure quality control.
That doesn't make sense.
But other, critics are saying, well, obviously there's money behind it because there's one single company that is being used to supply these masks. So obviously there was some kind of contract created. Otherwise there wouldn't be one company doing it, supplying them. And you know what I'm saying? There's always a lot more to every issue than meets the eye, right?
Yeah.
And then same with climate change. If we talk about plastics in general, contributing to the destruction of our environment, thus creating, contributing to climate change, then we see firsthand, Trudeau proposing that he wants to ban single-use plastics, except the multi-million-dollar oil industry says, whoa, 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 whoa. No, I don't think so. Countless jobs and economy relies on single-use plastics. Do you see what I'm talking about?
Mm-hmm.
With the thank you for smoking cigarette thing. The governments around the world make billions of dollars off taxing cigarettes. And, the government sells a product that on it, the government mandates to tell the people they're selling it to that it is destructive to your health. It doesn't take a genius to figure out the oxymoron in the cigarette.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But again, why is it being sold? Is it being sold because people want them? Is it sold because it makes and generates quite a bit of financial, money for the government, in turn back to the Canadian individual? Well,
Does so I know cigarette packs, like when you see a cigarette pack, like even in the movie they were speaking about how it has the skull and crossbones, or it has like some kind of destructive message. Just through research for that project that we had on the movie, and looking at the rise of like electronic e-cigarettes and vapes, has there been a mandate? Do you know anything about that? If there's been a mandate for having like a skull and crossbones on those?
Well, technically, since it's a different type of product, the entire, the laws around it are very different. So I don't know if you recall, like even up till last year, they did end up banning them. But advertising, so a number of years ago, cigarette advertising was banned in Canada on various degrees, right? So the last one to be banned was in-store advertisement. So, I'm sure you guys have gone into a gas station or a variety store, and right behind the checkout, there's all the cigarettes, right? And about 2 years ago, I don't know, maybe 3 years ago, they banned that. So they're all hidden now. And then when the e-cigarettes came out and the vapes, Juul and all that, there's pictures and advertising all over the place up till last summer, for even on billboards in the streets, Juul, the safer alternative, all that kind of advertisement. And then, quite quickly, the lobbyist groups, frankly, for the the side that's against nicotine and the nicotine related products, were successful in having the government change those rules. So now bless you. So now you can't even advertise those anymore. So if you go into a gas station, you don't see any advertising for any type of nicotine product. Does the actual Juul or what have you have those skull and crossbones on it? I'm not exactly sure, but I don't think so. And not to the effect that the cigarettes do. But again, another reason for that is that they're so new, they don't have decades of research against them, right? You guys remember all the popcorn lung stuff all over the news?
Yeah.
Notice how nobody talks about popcorn lung anymore? Do you know why?
No.
Well, some argue that the day that they stopped talking about popcorn lung was around the same exact time when the cigarette companies bought up all the major vape companies like Juul and the e-vapes. Because when Juul and the e-vapes first came out, they were owned by separate companies. And there was a huge war between the cigarette companies and the vape companies, because the vape companies were saying, the safer alternative, this and that, taking people away from buying,
Cigarettes.
natural cigarettes. Then companies like Philip Morris and things like that, like the big, huge tobacco manufacturers, bought up all these companies. And all of a sudden, there's no negative press about vapes anymore. It doesn't take 2 and 2 to figure out Why is the timing like that, right?
Mhm.
Again, I'm not trying to be a conspiracy theorist. I'm just pointing out, what people believe and the timing of things.
Yeah, but there's always correlations.
Well, that's what nothing can be proven, but you can look at timelines and notice that, exactly at the same time when the cigarette companies bought up all the vapes is when the news stopped reporting on things like popcorn lung and what have you. So up to you. Anyway, so next person. Who would like to go? We have two more. We have Vanya. Is it just Vanya? So one more. All right. Is Vanya here? Yes, good.
Hi, so I'm going to be talking about the use of vaccines and the argument between it. So, what is the purpose of vaccines? According to the World Health Organization, vaccines reduce the risk of getting a disease by working with your body's natural defenses to build protection. When you get a vaccine, your immune system responds. So, there are 4 different types of vaccines. There is live annotated vaccines, inactivated vaccines, subunit, and recombinant polysaccharide and conjugate vaccines, and also toxoid vaccines. So the first one is used for a weakened or annotated form of the germ that caused the disease, because these vaccines are so similar to the natural infection that they help prevent and create a strong and long-lasting immune response. The second one is a vaccine consisting of virus particles, bacteria, and/or other pathogens that have been grown in culture and then lose disease-producing capacity. For these vaccines, the specific virus or bacteria is killed with heat or chemicals, and its dead cells are introduced into the body. For example, hepatitis A, flu, polio, and rabies. Subunit, recombinant polysaccharide, and conjugate vaccines. These vaccines use specific pieces of the germ, like its proteins, sugar, or capsid. Because these vaccines use only specific pieces of the germ, they give a very strong immune response that's targeted to key parts of the germ. And toxoid vaccines are made from a toxin or poison that has been made harmless, but that elicits an immune response against the toxin, basically based on the toxin produced by a certain bacteria. So the argument about vaccines. There are 2 sides to this argument. There are those who support vaccines and who do not. The argument for those who do are, for example, there's a school of thought that refusing vaccines on behalf of your children amounts to child abuse and that their parents should be punished for their decisions. Now, it seems that Germany, Australia, and a number of other countries are fed up enough with vaccine refusing parents that they're experimenting with punitive measures. We haven't quite reached the level of child abuse charges, but the parents in these countries may face fines if they fail to give their kids the recommended shots. In Australia, the directors of school that let in the unvaccinated kids would be fined too. So I found a quote from a source from a Vox article called "The Global Crackdown on Parents Who Refuse Vaccines for Their Kids" is on. In Germany on Thursdays, lawmakers passed a law stating that parents need to prove they vaccinated their kids against measles or risk fines up to 2,500 euros, about $2,750. Unvaccinated children also risk losing their places in school. So these fines come amid a growing problem with measles globally. Over the past 2 years, measles cases have been edging up in countries around the world, with a 300% rise in cases over the same period in 2018, according to the World Health Organization. Italy's parliament passed a law that makes 10 childhood vaccinations mandatory for kids up to age 16 and requires parents to prove their children are immunized before entering school or face a $500 euro, which is about a 500 euro, which is about $560 non-compliance fine, and kids who aren't vaccinated are being told to not come into schools. In France, the health ministry made 11 vaccines, up from current 3, which is diphtheria, tetanus, and polio, mandatory for children, though there's no talk of a fine yet. So the second side of the argument are those who are anti-vaccine activists. And from my research, there were different reasons as to why people were against vaccines. For example, some cite religious beliefs as the reason behind their refusal to get vaccinated, though most mainstream religions do not condemn vaccines. There was a belief that diseases were disappearing due to better sanitation and hygiene, not vaccines. It was also believed that a vaccine wouldn't protect you. Those who are vaccinated can still get sick, but they will experience mild symptoms. People also think the risks outweigh the benefits. This is currently because the biggest objection in the United States, and parents cite many medical risks as potential consequences of being vaccinated. People have protested against vaccines within the past 10 years and desire to have control over their bodies, whether it should be vaccinated or not. So a quote that I found from an article from Spectrum, how anti-vaccine activists are using COVID-19 to boost their movement. Many people against vaccines are using the COVID-19 virus as a strategy for proving their points about the dangers of vaccines. Many anti-vaccine activists who have claimed that disease such as measles aren't that serious now contend that the coronavirus isn't dangerous enough to justify staying home. They agree with President Donald Trump that the cure for the pandemic could be worse than the disease itself. They believe that the virus is another example of the misuse of vaccines. So this quote says, "This is the time for people to take notice and really evaluate the freedoms they're giving up, all in the name of perceived safety," said Freedom Angels co-founder Heidi Munoz Gleisner in a Facebook video. So although I've talked about 2 articles that are opinion-based, the first article was basically just explaining the laws that were enforced in different countries. But I think that's really important to look at the facts and see the actual statistics and resources behind the research. For example, how common it is for countries around the world to enforce laws against vaccines. For example, European countries recommend or contemplate compulsory vaccines. Among them, 11 countries, and to be more specific, 35.4% have mandatory vaccinations for at least one out of diphtheria, tetanus, hepatitis B, poliovirus, influenza type B, measles, mumps, and more vaccines. And also, some US states are doubling down on existing vaccination requirements for school children by removing the ability for parents to legally refuse vaccines for non-medical reasons. So instead of finding an article that was opinion-based, I tried to find one that revolved around facts. And I actually found an article that was debunking myths with facts done by researchers and scientists. It was from Medical News Today. It was called "Debunking the Anti-Vaccination Myths." So there are different questions and myths about vaccines, and these are the main ones that many people question. So, for example, do vaccines weaken the immune system? In fact, it says that it's the opposite because vaccines expose the body's immune system to small, weakened versions of the disease. The process actually prompts the body to produce antibodies to fight off the infection, teaching the immune system how to fight off the disease. And another question was, is natural immunity better than immunity through vaccinations? And although sometimes natural immunity could be stronger than vaccine-acquired immunity, the risks of this approach could outweigh its benefits far more. And for example, to develop natural immunity to measles, a child would need to contract it first, However, it can cause many uncomfortable symptoms and give rise to several complications. About 1 in 20 children develop pneumonia during the infection, and a quarter of people who get measles will require a stay in the hospital. Measles complications can be life-threatening, and according to the World Health Organization, it states that in 2000 to 2017, vaccinations contributed to an 80% decrease in measles-related deaths. And I had a discussion question. Do you think that parents or guardians should be able to decide whether their child should be vaccinated or not?
Yeah, interesting. I mean, this has become quite a debate, but you did mention there are two sides. I think there's three sides. I think it's not as, I think the far left in this case is the one that's promoting vaccines, and the far right is against vaccines, if you really want to break it into two like that. And the idea is that, the conspiracy theory situation comes in. So I think a lot of anti-vaxxers, as they're known, are not against vaccines just because they're against vaccines. I think the idea of a vaccine is legitimate, science, etc. You take the vaccine and then you don't get the particular life-threatening illness. But I think what many people think is that obviously there's people who are against it or for it. But I think a lot of people who do the research can see that for instance, when I was a kid, there were 7 vaccines. There was no aluminum. There were no harsh chemicals and neurotoxins in them. And then all of a sudden there are 78 different vaccines. So you kids in my class, you guys would have got 78 vaccines, many of which contain neurotoxins like heavy metals and aluminum. And the idea is that's one of the biggest factors in why so many people are against vaccines today, is not because they don't believe that vaccines work, is that they're scared that the health risks of, I mean, I don't know if you guys want to Google what aluminum does to your brain, or mercury. It destroys it, right? The Mad Hatter character from Alice in Wonderland is mad, as in the British term for crazy, because in the 18th century they would use mercury on pelts to create the hats, and if you're exposed to mercury, it destroys your brain, and when your brain is destroyed, you go mad, you go crazy. In the correlation with the rise in autism, it's many people will be like, oh, vaccines don't cause autism, but a lot of people will point out the research shows that it's the ingredients in certain vaccines that are given today that were not included in the same vaccine 30 years ago that cause neuro problems and issues with brain development, etc. Right, and then of course with the potential, and answer Miriam's statement there, the potential of the COVID vaccine and the conspiracies involving Bill Gates. Vanya talked about 4 different types of vaccines. Well, the 5th type of vaccine is the type they're developing for the COVID vaccine, which is a electro vaccine. The conspiracy theorists talk about having a chip installed into the body, et cetera, right? And then of course more control. I mean, Dina, you can't make statements like maybe there isn't a rise in autism. I mean, you can make that, you can ask that question for sure, but none of these statements are valid because there is no proof. So there is no answer to them. Was there always this many people with autism and they weren't diagnosed, or are they able to diagnose them more, therefore there are more people with autism, right? It's just like Trump, what he said, if we didn't test as many people, we wouldn't have so many cases of COVID. It sounds absurd, but he said it. it's legitimate. It's a legitimate statement. It's truth. If there weren't so many tests, there wouldn't be so many cases on paper, right? In reality, that's obviously, doesn't take a genius to figure out how absurd that statement is. But on paper, if they didn't test as many people, there wouldn't be so many cases, right? Ontario just stopped testing people without asymptomatic people and without an appointment, and the amount of cases, are going to drop. But that's only because the amount of cases is not simply how many people have it, it's how many people are tested for it and found to be positive. You see what I'm saying? So the idea of, does a vaccine cause autism, I don't think is the question. I think it's does a vaccine contain neurochemicals, and do those neurochemicals cause problems? Right? And that they can study. That yes, aluminum, it's understood in the world of science, destroys the brain, causes Alzheimer's for some, for one. And the question that people who are anti-vaxxers, quote unquote, ask is, why is there aluminum in certain vaccines? Like, right? And then the vaccine manufacturers will either say, well, it's a preservative, or they will deny that it's in there, et cetera, right? So this is a huge issue right now. It's not even, the whole like go straight to autism thing is not even, comes from the pro-vaxxers, right? Like it's their rebuttal against anti-vaxxers. It's always autism. But anti-vaxxers are not talking about autism as much. They're talking about developmental issues that don't necessarily fit in. And, if you guys know anything about autism is a giant spectrum, right? I've studied psychology, and often psychologists, the spectrum is all of us. So it just depends on where we are on the spectrum, right? Right? At what point do we start talking about this person is autistic, when the spectrum is either, 0 to 100, and everyone is on that same spectrum? But yeah, it's an interesting question. And there's also the rise of kids, as soon as of parents who are anti-vaxxers, and as soon as they're 18, they go get vaccinated themselves, right? But the COVID vaccine is a very different type of vaccine. It's a new type of technology, and a lot of people who would have normally lined up to get a vaccine are weary about the speed at which it seems that they're developing them, the lack of testing, long-term, short-term, and to many people on both sides of the spectrum, that's very worrying, right? I'm not even going to the conspiracy that the vaccine is going to have a chip in it or what have you, right? Everyone should be given the choice to vaccinate their child. I do think everyone should, but at the end of the day, if the person's choice, it shouldn't be forced upon them. Well, again, it's a human rights issue, right? If herd immunity is a legitimate thing, then I had to do something. Oh, okay. Then it shouldn't matter that some people don't get vaccinated, right? Okay. Tyler. Okay. I don't understand what you're trying to prove. Are you trying to prove that, or point out that? Okay. But we're not talking about that. We're not talking about that. But are you saying that you believe that vaccines can cause autism, but it's better to get the vaccine? What are you trying to say?
Everyone should vaccinate.
Okay. Again, it's not. Yeah, I know. I've seen the Penn and Teller skit. Everybody has, but this isn't an issue on whether or not people should get vaccinated or shouldn't get vaccinated. I think it's just, we're pointing out the fact that nothing, again, in the world is black and white. But the way, and this is the perfect example of this bias exercise we're talking about, is that the vaccination versus anti-vaccination movement, the media very much portrays either side as an extreme side. It's either this way or it's that way. And that is the best example I could think of right now of emphasizing this bias thing, because it's not the way it is. There are other factors like the ones that I pointed out, right? Even doctors can be biased, so the only way is to become a scientist. Isn't a doctor a scientist? No? Yeah. So on that note, Dina, there's something called an Einstellung effect. And it's a term used in psychology to try to explain why, scientists are so stuck. Here, let me Google it. Stuck on one belief system because they've been taught that way, right? Einstellung effect. Here, let me cut and paste. Nope. So this basically is it's a legitimate psychological term to use to explain why. Yeah, well, okay. But that's the point, Dina. It's not like that. It's bigger than that. It's, a lot of, if we keep going to use the term anti-vaxxers or vaxxers, I don't like using those terms because they pit two extremes against each other. But the idea is, someone will ask, why would a doctor, let's not even talk about vaccines right now. Let's go to the opioid crisis. Why would a doctor knowingly prescribe an opioid when so many people are becoming addicted to opioids, lose their jobs, basically become drug addicts? Since when did vaccinate your kids become an extreme opinion? No, what I'm talking about is not when did your vaccination of kids become an extreme opinion. What I'm saying is that the media, the bias, has created two extreme sides, the vaxxers and the anti-vaxxers, without looking at the reasons, right? And on both sides, right? That's what I was talking about. So, if you go back to, historically, when vaccines were created, let's go back to the polio vaccine. Legitimately, the vaccine was created. It was used with ingredients that were not harmful, like aluminum and mercury and things like that. And sometime in the last 20-something years, all of a sudden, we went from 7 vaccines to 78 vaccines, and many of them have had neurotoxins as ingredients, right? So, a lot of that helps explain the rise in quote unquote anti-vaxxers, is that they don't want these extremely harmful chemicals being injected into their kids. It's not about whether or not they believe a vaccine works or not, which is a whole other issue. Because there's a lot of documentation saying they don't actually work. When there's also a lot of scientific documentation saying they do work, right? Like polio. So that's what I mean by the extreme opinion of one or the other. It is portrayed in the biased media as Either you do or you don't. When in reality, it's not black and white like that, right? There are many people who are pitted into the anti-vax movement that do give their children, 3 of the 78 vaccines, right? Because those particular 3 don't have neurotoxins in them, right? I'm just trying to explain, again, this is exactly the point that we're trying to make with these bias type news, presentations, is that once you look at the issue, every single issue, regardless of what it is not actually one-sided or the other side. There are always multiple variables and factors and different ways of thinking. That's the point I'm making, right? So, Miriam, because of Big Pharma. Well, go back to the Einstellung effect thing I just talked about. Why is it that, and the opioid crisis, how can you justify that a doctor whose mandate is to heal people will prescribe a known, drug like an opiate, like oxycodone or OxyContin, that's knowingly extremely addictive, that research shows that thousands and thousands and thousands of people have become addicted to it, lost their job, just like, crack addicts or heroin addicts, except this is, legitimate, legal prescribed drugs. How in their right mind would they be able to prescribe something like that to people, knowing all well that there's a potential of this person to become addicted to it? And the answer is the Einstellung effect. Now, in the news today or yesterday, one of the biggest pharmacy companies has been in negotiations with the courts because they've been sued because they know all well that the pharmaceutical companies have been basically created OxyContin, which is basically synthetic heroin, and it's come to light now over the last 15, 20 years, the destructive nature of it, that they knew all along that this is what it does to people. And basically, any day now that company is going to be sued for millions and millions of dollars. And they're in the middle of a negotiation right now to stay out of the courts, to plead guilty, but stay out of the courts, right? But doctors, again, read the Einstellung effect. That's why somebody who's supposed to be the most educated person, a medical doctor with lots of research, will knowingly prescribe this to a patient. I hope I just blew your mind. All right. Fantastic. But again, always more than one side to every story. Okay, so we've pretty much covered quite a bit of stuff. Now, I'm sure you were shocked earlier today when I posted all these things, but we're not going to go through, the 37 things I posted. Many of them are websites, and many of them are 1/2 page, 1/4 page, 2-page readings. But what we're going to talk about, we're not going back that far, is international conflict. But before we get to that point, yesterday when I was absent, I think the school board is still trying to figure out what in the world to do with second period and attendance. They don't actually know how to take attendance. So last week when I was absent, did you guys have attendance, or what happened?
Last week there was a teacher, and she took attendance. She asked us to say that we were here, and then she just indicated that we were supposed to do whatever.
Okay. So that wasn't even supposed to happen, because the supply teacher is only supposed to come in and cover my first period class, and then there is no supply teacher for the second period class. So I don't know what is going on. Nobody knows what's going on. Again, this is all new to me, just as it is for you guys. So yeah, anyway, regardless, all I do is post stuff. So let's take a look at conflict, international conflict, but not just international conflict. That's one part of it. conflict in general. Okay, so typically there's multiple types of conflicts within countries, within neighborhoods, between countries, between governments, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, the conflict is a big part of our world, unfortunately. So let's take a look at some of these things. So, non-governmental conflict, which means, unofficial wars, if you will, terrorism, tribalism, organized crime. Terrorism, we're going to take a look at I posted, excuse me. Excuse me. After 2001, September 11th, the world changed into, the word terrorism was mentioned 1,000 times a day. Everybody was talking about it, et cetera, et cetera. It was nothing new to the world, but it seemed to be a super new thing. And the world never changed back, right? It was like, let's go get those terrorists. Let's go get those terrorists. The war on terror, has it been successful? Arguably, absolutely not. Why is there even terrorism? Well, that's a different issue. Where does terrorism occur? And what's tribalism? Well, humans have a need to belong into a group. And we see tribalism as a sort of psychological predisposition in the human psyche, right? You're a part of a family, you're part of a school. My school is better than your school. My hockey team is better than your hockey team. This is a part of human nature, and it can become extreme, just like everything else can become extreme, right? We talked about nationalism. Trump is like a super nationalist, right? Best country in the world, best country in the world. We get the best drugs, we get the best everything, right? Ours is better than yours, right? That's all tribalism. And then, of course, it can create, a huge, division between people. Look at the whole Proud Boys thing lately. That is the funniest thing I've ever seen. Well, it's not the funniest thing I've ever seen. That's an extreme comment. I think it's extremely brilliant, though, that you guys know who the Proud Boys are?
Yeah, they're like a fascist.
Yeah.
Like an alt-right fascist group in the United States.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, they exist in Canada, too. A lot of people are members of the quote-unquote Proud Boys. But what can we do about it, right? We can label them as an organization, the government. We can, discuss them in the news, talk about them. But does that change anything? It has not. So somebody had a brilliant idea to get, homosexual couples, men, to post pictures of themselves with their partners and write #Proud Boys, because the whole pride thing. And it spread like wildfire. And basically now, if you Google Proud Boy, you don't get the terrorist or, they have been deemed a terrorist organization by some. But the alt-right organization, to say the least, you get pictures of, gay couples. It's super funny because nobody ever thought that they could take down, a whole organization like that by doing something so innocent.
But sir, they didn't take it down. The Proud Boys are still like out and about. And if anything, that the quote unquote reclamation of like the Proud Boys is actually like spreading their cause further.
How would you argue that?
Well, because for one, it's impossible to separate North American fascism from its racial from the racist elements. It's impossible to separate this type of fascism from the racial elements. And like a lot of the gay men who are trying to reclaim it are white. And like when a Proud Boy sees a gay man posting #Proud Boys, he doesn't see, oh wow, this degenerate is ruining this word. He's seeing, hey, this other white guy likes hating minorities. That's totally dope.
Yeah, that's arguable. I mean, you can't really say this is. I mean, none of those were truly, evidence-based facts that you said about white people only. I mean, I have a Facebook account. I have Instagram, and I can tell you for sure that I've seen non-white, if you want to call anybody who's non-white, gay guys posting, the same hashtag. But I guess the idea behind it, regardless of what the outcome is more people know what the Proud Boys are. So you could say, so more people who are already predisposed to believing in the fascist, far-right, racist agenda will now be like, there's a group called the Proud Boys. Or more people are witness to the fact that there's a group out there called the Proud Boys. Yes, they get more media attention, but on the same token, more people are seeing that, oh my goodness, I live in a country where, I don't know how many of you even knew that they exist in Canada, right? Someone just said, well, it's an American system. Well, no, unfortunately, they exist in Canada too, and I think in Europe as well. So, the idea is education. The more people know about it, the more the light is shined on this situation, right? The most dangerous type of, dangerous activity is the one that's hidden, right? In the shadows, right? We need this kind of organization to be brought to light so that people know that they exist, so that they can be, something can be done, right? But again, it's super strange to me personally that, that what we've seen in the last couple of years with the extreme movements of the far right and the far left, reminiscent of so many events in history. And when a government is on board with one side, potentially can cause a lot of violence and crime. And we are seeing it unfold in front of our eyes. It's a very dangerous world, and people need to understand and educate themselves of the history. What are you confused about? Was this recently? Yeah, very recently, like in the last week. What's confusing, Dina? About ho non-white, how? Because it's not Proud Boys, as in not gay men who are part of the far right movement of the Proud Boys. They've hijacked the name, or the hashtag at least, Proud Boys, because Pride, like the Pride Parade, is associated with the LGBTQ plus community. So it was like an affront to the Proud Boys, quote unquote, organization. That's their name, right? Gay men are proud boys, right? Does that make sense? Anyway, okay, moving on. So we've seen, and we're going to explore, especially in the readings and in the presentations, a few incidents, within quote unquote nations that have, pitted groups against each other. Ethnocentrism. We're going to take a look at nationalism. The Balkans. Prior to the First World War, if you guys remember in the grade 10 history class, one of the precursors to the First World War. If you studied the Rwandan genocide, maybe you'll take a look at it if you're taking that grade 12 culture, the other grade 12 religion course that's not philosophy. They talk about it in that class. A lot of people being displaced in African countries like the Congo because of ethnocentrism, and of course in apartheid in South Africa. We even saw a little bit of this in the CBC video that we watched the other day, right? The way that the British, who were part of, they had a 99-year lease on Hong Kong. We're going to talk about the lasting effects of conflict and colonialism. Once a conflict or what have you is no longer a live conflict, does that mean it's over? No, absolutely not. We're going to take a look at effects for years to come that might never, or new conflict that arises from these things, right? So what's ethnocentrism? Thinking one's own group is more superior than in others, right? We've seen this happen very many times. I mean, the most famous one that we all learn about in school is Hitler and the Nazi Party, and their attempted overtaking of Europe and the world, right? But at the same time, the Japanese had a very ethnocentric view in the Second World War and leading up to the Second World War. And today, there are groups of people who have a very ethnocentric type of view about their own superiority over others. There's Arab and the Israeli nations, Israel and the Arab nations, multinational states like Indonesia or Malaysia. I mean, Malaysia has a very large population of Cantonese, of those who have Cantonese heritage, as well as Malays. And the people, they're all citizens of Malaysia, but the people who are of Cantonese origin or background do not share the same rights as those that are Malaysian. These are problems in the world, and one of the problems that have arisen from politics and ethnocentrism, right? I have some readings that you can take a look at the Berlin airlift and all these things. You're going to read about just very simply 1 or 2 pages about the Korean War, Suez Crisis, Vietnam War. The Cold War was an interesting one. Obviously, you could do an entire university lecture credits on just espionage in the Cold War, McCarthyism, etc. But these are, things that came out of the Second World War, new conflicts, new issues, and events, right? Fun fact, during the Cold War, there was an arms race, there was a space race, and, one of the things that many of the people talked about in the 1960s and 70s, especially, in America and in Soviet Union, is that the satellite technology, surveillance technology was so good in the 70s and 60s and 70s that they could see faces from a satellite in the 1960s and 70s, right? This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is fact. So imagine if it was that good that you could see faces in the 60s and 70s from a satellite, how good satellites are today. Just think about that for a second. That's surveillance. What they can see. So speaking of espionage, spies and surveillance and things like that. Now, McCarthyism was an interesting one. We talked about the Red Scares a couple times in grade 10 history. I've mentioned it a number of times in this class. The Americans' history on, the extreme fearfulness of anything left-wing, right? And so, they had all these hearings. They accused people of being, communists, etc. And it happened in Canada too, right? Not to the same extent, but people were monitored, were followed for any activities that were, anything left-wing. And there was a big fear because of the fact that the Cold War existed. The other great superpower, the Soviet Union and the United States, neither one won or lost the Second World War. And they remained superpowers in a Cold War situation. And so that led to basically the last 70 years, or next 50 years of, development and ideology, right? Which still exists in many ways today. Arms race, often people argue the only reason we never drop the bombs on each other is because of MAD, mutually assured destruction, right? A lot of countries have stockpiled nuclear weapons, and the finger's on the trigger, but the reason it hasn't happened is because it is understood through this ideology that if one country sends a nuclear bomb to another country, that country will retaliate, and within an hour, a couple of minutes, who knows, but the whole world will be destroyed. And so it's like, what's the point of having any of this even exist, right? And then again, lots of fear of the other side, what happened in the Cold War, right? Lots of incidents. Anyway, you'll read about these and more. But there are positives. I mean, if you see the space thing as a positive thing, one of the positive things that ever happened, many argue, was the space race. I mean, the race between the USSR and the United States in terms of space technology. The USSR were the first to send somebody to space. Yuri Gagarin. The Americans were the first to land on the moon, unless you believe in that conspiracy theory that nobody ever landed on the moon. And people don't talk about that conspiracy theory as often as they do now about Bill Gates and stuff, because it's not fashionable. But there were legitimate arguments against it, seeing as it was a race. And in 1962, JFK, John F. Kennedy said, I'm going to land a person on the moon by the end of this decade. So in 1969, that's when the Americans set foot on the moon. So automatically people were like, well, they weren't there yet, but they had to do it because they had promised it. So that, this type of thing makes people think of conspiracy theories, right? And then the time in 1961 when there was almost a nuclear war between the Soviets and the Americans, but it was averted. And then of course the missile crisis. So do I have any more things in here? So like I said, a lot of these are just little readings about everything that we kind of just glanced over. But I do have a couple types of conflict. Was there more? What do I want to show you? Okay, well, I'll show you this one. So let's look at types of conflict in more detail. Wait, this is the same one. Did I post the wrong thing? Maybe I did. But shoot. Hold on, give me 1 second. I think I posted the same thing twice, but I wasn't supposed to. Types of conflict, yes. Okay. And then, oh, never mind. Okay, scratch that one, but let's take it after the conflict. No, not that one yet. Ending conflict. Okay, so ending conflict between governments, and then the Canadian way. So we talk about foreign relations lately. Sometimes they go sour, thus we go to war. And other times there is resolution between states, between individuals, etc. History is full of wars and conflict, and historians have had a lot of incidents to study and analyze, and thus incorporate into how to avoid it. That's the point, right? So basically, conflict resolution cycle is what has come out of how to end conflicts. And this works for individuals, for states, etc. And basically, it's number one is always conflict avoidance, right? You want to avoid any type of conflict. If there is conflict, they usually begin with informal discussion. So we can see this type of thing in the news. In the last couple, year or two, there's a lot of this been portrayed by the media when it comes to, Trump and the Chinese. Right before COVID hit, there was a lot of talk about, Trump and China. And, one would say something, not necessarily directly to China, but about China. Trump would threaten or what have you. Then China would rebut, not again directly to America, but in the news, right? And then if it goes further, then there needs to be negotiation. If negotiation fails, an arbitrator or mediation is brought in, then litigation. If that fails, unfortunately, violence becomes the part of the cycle, and then circular again. The problem with that is that if any of the steps fail, violence seems to be the key way to work in this world. And hence why Americans spend so much on their military structure, why China, Korea have such a huge military when arguably people are starving in the world, but they can, send surveillance satellites into the world, right? So again, conflict avoidance, right? Very important. Violence is the only one out of this 6 that do not go back into conflict avoidance, obviously. And of course, every country or a lot of countries have policies to end conflict, right? Diplomats in other countries that are there. One of the first things that happens when there's an issue is the country brings back their diplomats. We have international laws like The Hague we talked about, sanctions which are used, which arguably don't work very often, foreign aid, alliances, etc., right? So there's a couple of case studies I posted for you to discuss how things are handled or how they were handled in terms of handling international conflict. And you'll read that some worked and some did not. Right? The UN has peacekeeping missions in many parts of the world, in hot zones where there's fighting, but then also in places where there are more, potential of fighting. And once the conflicts are over, we see colonialism, we see post-war problems. Let's take a look at these questions. You're gonna read more about these, but I'm going over them before you do your readings and things. But we talk about colonialism. What is colonialism? Being in this online class, every single person in the thing has a red, no video thing. And I'm like, am I talking to myself here? Or am I actually talking to class? There you are, Matthew. What's colonialism? Occupying a country with settlers. Sure.
It's like trying to grasp political control over a country through like things such as like legislation and policy. Sure.
I mean, that's the kind of stuff that happens, through the negotiation process that we're talking about. Mm-hmm. But there's a few countries, not just in Europe, but in Europe's the popular ones to discuss as our history is directly tied to Europe. But often there was a colonization of an area of the world that had inhabitants, either through force or through not, and then processes occur where eventually, possibly, the colonization ends, but there's a lasting legacy. So in Canada, though we're an independent country, we're still part of the Commonwealth of nations in the United Kingdom. So the British, many people still refer to us as a British colony, even though we non-violently do no longer have that control over us. But even after we gained independence, we are still had rules that we had to change. Remember the reason why in grade 10 you learn why Canada entered the First World War was because automatically we would, etc. So speaking of colonization, what's the most popular sport in India?
Cricket.
Yes. And why is cricket, a British game, the most popular sport in India?
Because the British colonized India.
Right. But don't you think that if there was so much, would there be negativity towards the British? The India is an independent country now, that it'd be strange to hold on to something like that from an occupier?
I don't think so, because we still hold on to stuff that the British acknowledge, and we no longer are occupied by the British.
Yeah, but I think Canada's story is a little different than India, right? Because when you say we, our ancestors came from other parts of the world. Maybe your ancestors came from the United Kingdom, but Canada had a very, an indigenous, population, and I don't think the indigenous are, super happy with the British, whereas the people, the immigrants who came afterwards, like our parents, have a different mentality because they weren't part of that existing culture. Whereas in India, it's the oldest civilization to still exist, right? The Hindus are the oldest religion in existence, basically a culture of people. And so, yeah, Dina, it's hard to get rid of something that got integrated in the culture, right? By occupiers, right? Again, some people might not even really realize the history, or it's become adopted by the inhabitants of that country. But the cricket issue in India is studied, is an interesting one, because it's like the most popular sport, but it is almost arguably a symbol of the colonialization of India by the British, right? Australia, also very, very, interesting mindset. When I lived in Australia, number two, where did the United Kingdom send many of its criminals in the 1800s? The answer is Australia. At the time, people were like, they're kicking me out of my country and making me go to the other side of the world. Today, you'd be surprised how many people not only know the story of their ancestor and what they did, but are proud of it, right? Right? Which is the city with the largest number of Portuguese-speaking people? Do you guys know?
No.
Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Well, proud not that they're criminals, but proud that a big part of it is not that they're criminals, but proud that their ancestors were sent to Australia, survived, and built a country. But you have to understand, some of these people stole an apple and were sent away. Others were, multi-murderers and sent away. Most likely the murderers would have been killed, but you know what I mean, right? So that's my point I'm trying to make, is that what are they proud of, right? Yeah, South America is interesting. And Australia and New Zealand, very different, because the British went to Australia, took over the land and the people, oppressed the indigenous people and etc. Whereas there was indigenous people, the Maori specifically in New Zealand, but they fought back and they actually never beat them. And so they actually had a truce. And so the country of New Zealand, even though it's often, compared to Australia, is very different culturally, because the Maori people who were indigenous to New Zealand fought back and ended up in a stalemate with the British and creating a truce. So New Zealand is very much like a 50-50 British Maori type of culture, whereas the Australians they don't view the indigenous people the same way. That's for sure. And then of course there's languages. The language of the oppressor can be, or the colonializer, is still spoken as a main language today. Many African countries, they speak French, English around the world, etc. Or Arabic. I mean, Arabic is not so much a history of colonialization as a political spreading, if that makes sense, right? In South America, Central America, what's the most popular sport? It's soccer, right? Where's soccer from? It's a European sport. We can take a look at these things, but the point we're trying to make with these questions is there are lasting effects of China invented soccer. There you go. I'll take your word for it. There's a lasting effects of colonialization, and it's hard for people to grasp their understanding or to accept some of the history sometimes. This past year, COVID's not the only thing that's been all over the news, but we've had, the potential erasing of histories or the toppling of statues or the changing of names, right? Most recently, the Vaughan High School is no longer called Vaughan High School. It's just called High School now for some reason. They haven't caught a new name, and that's because people are coming to the forefront saying, these people had ties to racism and all that, but they're also the founding fathers of the countries. So it's very hard to grasp that situation and understand it and accept it, right? So colonialism is the political theory governing colonial expansion and the maintenance of a colonial empire. It's generally associated with the belief that the mores of the colonizer are superior to those of the colonizer, the needs of the colonizer. And the political theory of post-colonialism argues that many of the problems faced by former colonies are attributed to their colonial exploitation, right? So the point is that the colonizer comes in, takes away the things that the colonized need, and then leave. And then there are problems that exist that wouldn't have existed or didn't exist before the colonizer. And this is seen throughout the world in many, many countries, unfortunately, right? Others argue that while colonialism may be wrong, that need not imply that it has caused the economic problems of the third world, right? So one of the biggest ideas is the third world exists because of colonization, right? People went to Africa, they took everything, including people, and didn't allow the countries to, progress and grow as the West did, right? They would take the mines, etc. But that's not always the case, because there are countries in the world that were colonies that are not third world countries, that are very well-to-do countries. like South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore. I mean, you know, Singapore, I've never been. I'd love to go. But after seeing that movie, Crazy Rich Asians, I was like, wow, there's some seriously rich people in this place. Have you ever seen that movie? That movie was pretty good.
Sir, I love that movie. I think I've seen it like 5 times.
Yeah, I kept putting it off, and then I watched it this summer. I was with my wife, and I was like, oh, this is a good movie. And it was funny because it was, you know, St. Rob's, all the rich people. Singapore is amazing. Singapore is like the Toronto of the other side of the world, right? It's like a multicultural country area, whereas Toronto is like a multicultural country, right? Yeah. All right. So, percentage of territories belonging to the European or colonial powers, 90.4% of Africa was in 1900. You know, look at these numbers. That's pretty nuts if you really look at it, meaning that people from some other part of the world controlled these people, you know, and took from them, right? Resources, people, etc. Right? And these are small countries: UK, France, Belgium, Netherlands, Germany, many of the countries that were colonizers, very small countries colonizing big parts of the world, right? I mean, the UK is the biggest one at 470 million people, or colonies, people in the colonies, right? And at one time or another, every country in North America, South America, Africa, Middle East, Southeast Asia, Oceania were colonized by Europeans. Just think about it, right? Hence why so much of our culture is Eurocentric, and so many people are moving away from it. Even you know, your typical map. When you see the map behind me, you know, often we don't even. Can you see that? You know, you've seen maps. Europe is right in the middle of the map, even though the world is a globe, right? The only place I've ever seen a map where Europe wasn't in the middle, Australia was in the middle, and it was an Australian. You've seen a U.S. map with that in the middle? I heard. Yeah, I don't know. No, and one of the biggest reasons argued is that, well, when they developed the time zones and the latitude and longitudinal lines, what's zero longitude, the prime meridian goes right through Europe, England specifically, because the person inventing it, you know, was of an English descendants. Anyway, all the maps in Australia have Australia in the middle of it. It's pretty awesome. Right? The old saying, the sun never sets on the British Empire. And the lasting effects. Now, apartheid was, you know, one thing that you might have studied, but was a, you know, very, very negative part of our history. Basically, it was a system in the system well after the, you know, the Nazi party and the atrocities they did in South Africa, and basically lasted from 48 to 94. But there are other countries that had, you know, discrimination. I mean, we still see, arguably, in the United States and Canada, discrimination, not ingrained in the system, but manifested in everyday life, right? The BLM movement sheds light on, you know, the fact that there's a disproportionate amount of black people that are shot and killed by police, or even for crimes committed, sent to jail, right? I'm sure you've all seen memes of, like, you know, a rich white looking person who, you know, embezzled millions of dollars, and then on the bottom it says sent to, you know, jail for 3 months, and on the right it's like some, you know, younger black kid, and he's like, you know, caught with a gram of pot, sent to jail for 30 years. You know what I mean? This is injustice, and these are the things, you know, that unfortunately are part of colonialization, are lasting, long-lasting effects and consequences. You know, but in apartheid Africa, you know, it's argued it went from one side all the way to the other, where those of of the African background and those of the British and Dutch background live very different lives. The British and Dutch, or Afrikaans, as they're known, the descendants, lived like kings, had white person only types of benefits, whereas the black people had no benefits, etc. And once the end of apartheid happened, it's argued that it switched exactly the opposite, where the white people had their rights stripped away, land taken away, etc. Again, lots of lasting effects on things like this, right? There is a movie, we're not going to watch it today, maybe we'll watch it tomorrow, I don't know, called, what is it, This Is My Country or something. It really sheds a good light on apartheid. Let me see what it's called. In My Country. I don't know. I'd like to watch a couple more movies in class. Movies are always a great way to shed light on issues, but again, always think critically about any movie you're watching, because there is always a bias behind them, right?
Sir, I really liked Thank You for Smoking.
It was interesting, wasn't it? I liked how they did it. The same director did Juno. I don't know if you guys have ever seen the movie Juno.
Yes, we have.
And then, of course, his father is a very, very famous director. Did like Ghostbusters and all these different movies.
Talented family.
Yeah, and I don't know if you guys have ever seen the show Working Moms on CBC. No, who watches Canadian shows? Anyway, that's his sister. She's also pretty famous. But anyway, yeah, really shed light on, in a farcical manner, the way the system works, right? Same with the death of Stalin. Was how much of what happened behind the scenes or was made up or joked about? Honestly, my parents grew up in communist Hungary, and growing up, they would talk about how that's the way the system was. Like, it's just the way it was, right? You had to pretend and act one way because the walls had ears, Anyway, the struggle to end apartheid, right? It did end. There was a lot of international pressure. Some heroes like Nelson Mandela, songs, music, etc. And what finally worked? Diplomacy, sanctions, public pressure, and finally South Africa became a free country. But again, it switched, many argue, to the exact opposite. So the ancestors of the white colonials were scared for their lives. Many left. Much of their land was taken away from them, etc. Even though it was supposed to be a diplomatic exchange, etc. And fragmentation, breakup. Lots of countries after the fall of the Soviet Union were divided, economically had problems, etc. We saw some wars like the Bosnian conflicts, etc., occur afterwards. The Czech Republic and Slovakia is now two countries. It used to be Czechoslovakia. But again, many, many problems existed. Nothing, world peace is not just about the elimination of wars between countries, within borders, within people. Very important to balance the needs of everybody, right? And then, of course, in 2020, we see the rise of neo-nationalism, unfortunately. Facepalm, right? Especially coming from the United States, but not only United States. We just see that often in the news, most often, because they're our neighbors and they're a superpower. But, remember that movie that we watched, the documentary about the legacy of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms? They talk about Germany, Hungary, Turkey. This is an issue that's happening, and it's rising. And what can we do about it? I don't know. Let's see what happens in 3 weeks? 1, 2, 3, 3.5 weeks. The American election.
Is that 3 weeks? We find out then.
November 3rd is the election. Whether or not we find out the winner that night, we'll probably find out that next day, but it'll be then, unless something crazy happens between now and then. Who do you think is going to win? I honestly, nobody can answer that question, because no matter how much, Trump is portrayed as a clown in the media, you have to remember he has a lot of followers. A lot of followers. Hillary's going to win. Right?
But I mean, sorry, I keep.
Did you see what came out of last night's vice presidential election? Hashtag fly on my head.
Yeah. But I mean, this election, upcoming election, maybe it wasn't because these stars were as prevalent on social media, but you see a lot of like social media influencers, big, A-list movie stars and singers, whereas before, like, posting about how you should vote for Biden and encouraging their followings to vote against Trump. Whereas 4 years ago, it was a little less prominent. People were more shy to the idea of, in that kind of power, telling people where they stood politically.
I don't know. I don't agree with that. I think it was very similar 4 years ago, but I think the fundamental difference is that 4 years ago, a lot of people thought, what kind of chance does Trump have? There's no way. And there was a relaxed type of like, oh my goodness, this is a shoo-in for Hillary. I mean, her opponent is Donald Trump. Come on. And then boom, he wins. And it was a huge shock. I'm sure you've seen, I don't know if you have seen Fahrenheit 11/9. They talk all about that in that movie. It's really well done. But then flash forward 4 years, all the things Trump has done, and unfortunately, a lot of the things he has done is create more followers, but at the same token, also divided, creating those that are against him, and radicalized both sides, which means that this time, the election, I think there's going to be more voters, and there's more people that are strongly thinking, well, it happened once, it could happen again. Whereas we didn't have that mentality before that.
Wait, so what about the Electoral College? Because Hillary won the popular vote, right?
The other problem, right? The whole system. So that's why you can't simply say, Florida, one of the most important states in the United States, which has a lot of power in that regard, is predominantly a Trump supporting state, right? Or not even just Trump, just a Republican. And that's why you can't answer like, who do you think is going to win? Because I think it's going to be pretty close.
True.
I'd say the biggest thing against Trump is the fact that major Republicans are now like taking a stand against him, like the Lincoln Project, I think, and other groups.
I know, but there's too many factors in the like the Electoral College thing with if he wins a certain state, that gives him 36 versus 0 points kind of thing, right? This is the fundamental problem, not whether or not some people are going to vote or not. As long as that state gets 50 plus 1%, he gets that many more seats, and this is a problem, right? So we're just going to have to sit and wait. Like I said, we're still going to be in this class together. November 3rd, we're in this class together till November 10th or 11th or whatever it is, and we'll see. Anyway, let's why don't you guys take a look at all these things I posted. I know there's a lot of things, but they're mainly really short, like 2 pages long, not even, just kind of shed light on some different conflicts and resolutions that have existed. You know, this one's not even 7 lines long. Okay, and then we'll reconvene tomorrow. We'll see each other in the morning. Oh my goodness, I'm so excited.
That's interesting. Oh, you'll get to see everyone.
See you tomorrow morning.
Bye, sir.
Bye.
Ciao.